It is the 20th of June, 1940, in a requisitioned country house near Portsmouth, and a man named Stuart McCrae is standing in a walled garden holding what looks like a Christmas bauble on the end of a broom handle. Inside the glass sphere sits a viscous, treacle-colored explosive. Around the outside, a stocking has been stretched and coated in a birdlime adhesive so tenacious that McCrae's own fingers are already stuck fast to the casing. Somewhere behind a sandbagged wall, an old French tank hull waits, scrounged from a scrapyard for exactly this purpose. McCrae draws back his arm, releases a safety pin, and hurls the device towards the armor plate. It strikes, sticks, and a heartbeat later detonates with a crack that flattens a section of steel as though it were tin foil. Nobody in that garden could quite believe what they had just seen, because everybody in that garden knew, with total certainty, how ridiculous the thing in their hands actually was. That ridiculous device would become known to the men who carried it, sometimes affectionately and sometimes with real dread, as the sticky bomb. Officially, it was the Grenade Hand number 74, ST, a name so bureaucratically dull that it gives no hint of the desperation behind it. Britain in the summer of 1940 stood weeks away from what many believed was an imminent German invasion, and the army charged with repelling that invasion possessed almost nothing capable of stopping a tank. This is the story of a weapon built from glue, glass, and sheer nerve, a design so flawed that it terrified the men who used it nearly as much as the enemy, and yet one that, against every sensible expectation, worked. To understand why anyone would build a bomb designed to stick to your own hand, you first have to understand the scale of the disaster at Dunkirk. Between late May and early June 1940, the British Expeditionary Force had been driven off the continent, and in the chaos of that evacuation, it left behind almost everything that mattered for fighting an armored enemy. Roughly 23,000 vehicles were abandoned or destroyed on French beaches and roads, along with the overwhelming majority of the army's field guns and anti-tank weapons. What came home was men, and precious little else. The standard British anti-tank rifle of the period, the Boys, could barely penetrate the armor of contemporary German tanks, even at close range, and by 1940 it was already becoming obsolete against newer designs. The Army's actual anti-tank guns, the 2-pounders, existed in numbers nowhere near sufficient to equip the Home Guard units, and depleted regular formations now expected to defend the entire coastline of southern England. This was not a shortfall that could be solved through the ordinary channels of procurement and testing. Normal weapons development in peacetime might take years, moving through committees, trials, and gradual refinement. Britain in the summer of 1940 did not have years. Intelligence suggested a German invasion fleet could be ready within weeks, and Winston Churchill's government was operating under the assumption that the country might have to fight tank columns on English roads with whatever could be scraped together. Home Guard units, poorly equipped part-time soldiers who had signed up faster than the War Office could arm them, were drilling with pikes, shotguns, and in some documented cases, nothing more than farm tools. Against a panzer division, this was not merely inadequate, it was close to suicidal, and everybody from the Prime Minister downward understood it. Into this crisis stepped an organization with an appropriately theatrical name, MD1, the Ministry of Defence's unofficial weapons workshop, run out of that same country house, the Firs, at Whitchurch in Buckinghamshire, under the wartime nickname Churchill's toy shop. MD1 answered directly to Churchill rather than to the conventional military bureaucracy, which meant its engineers could bypass the usual months of committee approval and simply build things. Its leading figures were Millis Jefferies, a Royal Engineers officer with a gift for improvised explosives, and Stuart McCrae, the same man who had stuck his fingers to that prototype in the garden. Between them, they were given an almost impossible brief: devise something, anything, that an ordinary soldier or home guardsman could use to disable a tank at close quarters, using materials Britain could actually manufacture in the middle of a supply crisis. Their solution leaned on a simple and slightly desperate insight. If you could not build a gun powerful enough to punch through armor from a safe distance, you could instead build a bomb designed to be placed directly against that armor, where even a modest explosive charge would be devastating. The weapon that emerged was a glass sphere, roughly the size of a large orange, packed with a nitroglycerin-based explosive compound. That sphere was wrapped in a stocking, and the stocking was then coated in a powerful adhesive derived from birdlime, the sticky substance traditionally used to trap songbirds. The whole assembly was mounted on a wooden handle fitted with a spring-loaded striker and a pin, not unlike a conventional grenade. A soldier would pull the pin, releasing a protective metal casing that fell away to expose the sticky surface beneath, then either hurl the device at a tank or, in the method the manual actually preferred, run up and press it directly onto the armor by hand before pulling a secondary safety collar and stepping well clear. The adhesive would hold the charge fast to the metal for the roughly 5 seconds it took the fuse to detonate, giving the explosive time to concentrate its force inward rather than sliding harmlessly off. On paper, the physics made sense. A shaped charge held tight against armor plate could crack or dish the metal, sending fragments spalling off the interior surface with lethal force even without fully penetrating, and against the thinner top and side armor of many early war tanks, this could disable the vehicle or kill the crew inside. In practice, the weapon was a manufacturing and handling nightmare almost from the first production run. The glue that was meant to bond only to enemy steel proved entirely indiscriminate, sticking just as readily to uniforms, webbing, rifle slings, and the fingers of the men carrying it. Reports from training units described soldiers arriving at the range with the bomb fused to their trouser leg, and more than one training accident occurred when a stuck device detonated far closer to its thrower than intended. The casing itself was fragile, prone to cracking during transport or even rough handling, at which point the sticky coating would begin to gather dust, grit, and fibers from clothing and equipment, steadily reducing its effectiveness the longer it sat in a soldier's kit. Production, meanwhile, relied on ordinary glass blowers and hosiery manufacturers pressed into wartime service, since Britain simply lacked the specialized industrial capacity to mass-produce a purpose-built casing quickly. Roughly 2.5 million No. 74 grenades were eventually manufactured over the course of the war, though official figures on early production runs remain incomplete, a reflection of just how improvised the entire program was. If you are finding this interesting so far, a quick subscribe genuinely helps this channel keep making them. Despite its flaws, the sticky bomb did see real combat use, and its operational record is a study in contrasts between the weapon's reputation and its occasional battlefield success. It was issued widely to Home Guard units across southern England during the invasion scare of 1940 and 1941, though thankfully the anticipated German landings never came, sparing Britain the full test of pikes and sticky bombs against panzer columns on English lanes. Where the weapon found its most documented use was in the North African campaign, where British and Commonwealth infantry facing Italian and German armour in the open desert sometimes had little else at close range. There are accounts from the fighting around Tobruk and later engagements of soldiers using the number 74 against lightly armoured vehicles and the more vulnerable engine decks of tanks, with mixed but occasionally decisive results. The weapon also found a quieter, less official life within the Special Operations Executive, which supplied variants of sticky-style charges to resistance groups in occupied Europe for sabotage against vehicles, rail equipment, and fixed installations. Contexts where the awkward stickiness of the device mattered less than its portability and raw, destructive punch. Exact figures for enemy vehicles disabled by the sticky bomb specifically, as opposed to other anti-tank methods used alongside it, are not reliably documented, and many wartime accounts blend several improvised weapons together in the retelling. Set against German and American equivalents, the sticky bomb looks like exactly what it was: a stopgap born of crisis rather than considered design. The Germans, working from a position of relative material strength in the early war years, fielded the Haftorladung, a magnetic hollow charge grenade that clamped to armor using magnets rather than glue. A solution that was both more reliable and more effective, since its shaped charge could genuinely penetrate thick armor rather than merely damaging it. It arrived later in the war, from 1942 onward, once German industry had the spare capacity to refine such a device. The Americans, entering the conflict with a functioning industrial base behind them, generally skipped this category of improvised close assault weapon altogether, moving instead toward the bazooka /, a rocket-propelled weapon that let a soldier engage armor from a genuinely survivable distance. Compared with either alternative, the number 74 was a blunt instrument, built not because it was the best solution available, but because it was the only solution Britain could produce fast enough to matter. Its one real virtue was speed of development and simplicity of manufacture, values that mattered enormously in the summer of 1940, and mattered far less once Allied industrial output caught up with the threat. The sticky bomb's genuine legacy is more psychological and symbolic than it is a matter of confirmed tank kills. Its greatest contribution, arguably, was never fired at all. Simply knowing that some kind of close-quarters anti-tank weapon existed, however imperfect, gave Home Guard units and hard-pressed regular soldiers a measure of confidence during the darkest months of 1940, at a time when confidence itself was a strategic resource Britain could not afford to lose. Military historians examining the period generally treat the number 74 as a stopgap rather than a triumph, useful chiefly because Britain had nothing better and needed something immediately, its real value lying in morale and in buying time until better weapons, such as the Piat, arrived in 1943. Several examples of the sticky bomb survive today in museum collections, including the Imperial War Museum in London and the Tank Museum at Bovington, where visitors can see the fragile glass casing and worn wooden handle up close and understand, in a way that no description quite conveys, just how improvised the whole thing really was. Its influence on later weapons design was limited, since the shaped charge and magnetic principles that followed it culminating in weapons like the Piat and eventually rocket-propelled grenades, moved away from adhesive attachment entirely, but as an artifact of a nation improvising under existential pressure, it has few rivals. Return for a moment to that walled garden near Portsmouth, to Stuart McCrae standing with his fingers stuck fast to a glass bomb of his own devising, laughing despite himself at the absurdity of what Churchill's Toyshop had just built. That image captures something true about Britain in 1940 that no official history quite manages to convey. This was a country that, stripped of nearly all its proper equipment on the beaches of Dunkirk, facing an enemy that had just conquered most of Western Europe in a matter of weeks, did not simply wait for salvation to arrive from better-equipped allies. It built a bomb out of glue and glass and desperation, handed it to farmers and shopkeepers serving in the Home Guard, and told them it might just save their lives. The sticky bomb was not elegant. It was not, by any honest technical measure, a particularly good weapon, and the men who carried it knew this better than anyone, trading nervous jokes about which unlucky soul would end up glued to his own grenade. And yet it worked, not always as designed, not always without cost to the men who used it, but often enough, in enough desperate moments in the desert and in the shadows of occupied Europe, to matter. It bought Britain something more valuable than any single tank it disabled. It bought time, and it bought the belief that the fight could still be fought. That, in the end, is the strange and stubborn genius of the sticky bomb. It was never meant to be clever. It was only ever meant to work, and against every sensible expectation, it did.